Now, the East African crude oil pipeline being built in Uganda and Tanzania is facing harsh criticism from environmental groups. They fear that the $5 billion oil extraction project will pose serious environmental and social risks to protected wildlife areas, lakes, and displace thousands of families across the region.
The project, which includes crude oil extraction in Uganda and a 1,443-kilometer pipeline to Tanzanian coastline, involves corporate interests from France and China, as well as Ugandan and Tanzanian energy companies. The project has been endorsed by various East African leaders and is set to improve energy security, boost economies, and reduce poverty. Energy experts predict the success of the pipeline will increase Africa's direct investment by 60%. But climate activists have staged a number of campaigns calling for banks and investors to withdraw funding. They say the project will increase carbon dioxide emissions by 34 million tons annually at a time when the world is racing to reduce reliance on fossil fuels. Other potential negative effects include water contamination at Lake Victoria Basin, which activists fear can lead to a rise in outbreaks such as cholera and typhoid. Meanwhile, the pipeline project is expected to start transporting oil in 2025.
Well, for some analysis, we're now joined by Horn of Africa analyst Dr. Mustafa Yusuf-Ali. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. Always good to talk to you.
Good to speak with you, Peter.
All right, so there's two ways to look at this. Some might say this pipeline is a great economic development, and then there are the environmentalists who are concerned that this could pose a huge danger. Is there a middle ground?
Of course, there's always a middle ground when it comes to this kind of discoveries and prospecting and drilling of oil and gas. There will always be pros and cons when we are talking about fossil fuels in terms of environment and development. However, what needs to be looked at very carefully is what is the benefit to the local communities. First of all, the countries in the Middle East have benefited a lot from drilling and selling their oil and gas. Countries in the north, in Europe, developed because of coal and other forms of energy, including just basically deforesting their countries. And what we should do in Africa is to balance the prospecting, drilling, and selling oil and gas, and balance that with the environment and people's grassroots needs that are required. And therefore, balancing development and drilling is very important.
So, what are the genuine fears for the environment? I mean, one looks at energy companies and they have a poor track record on the continent, especially when you look at places like Nigeria, Niger Delta. They do not cover themselves in glory.
And that's where the challenge is. The biggest challenge is not the existence of the oil resources on the continent. It is the management of the oil resources. And this is why you see Nigeria, a country rich and blessed with oil resources, but poorly managed these resources to a point where it's become a disaster to communities, particularly in the Delta region. If you compare Norway and Nigeria, for example, Nigeria probably has more oil, but mismanages this oil resource. Norway has also lots of oil resource, manages their oil resources well, including putting aside wealth in the sovereign fund for future generations. And therefore, they have succeeded in the way they are managing these resources. So these countries in Africa, including Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Ivory Coast, that have discovered huge amounts of oil should focus on the management of this resource if they are going to succeed.
They talk about, I think, 14,000 families being displaced. I mean, that's a huge social impact if this project goes ahead as planned.
Absolutely. And in Tanzania and Uganda, if this project, which is touted to be the largest one of the largest projects in East Africa and the longest heated pipeline in the world, covering some 1,450 kilometers, almost 1,000 miles, is going to displace quite a number of people. There will be up to 14,000 people that will lose their land or part of their land, and up to 500 households that will have to be relocated. Now, the government of Uganda and Tanzania should be very careful about this and be transparent and accountable in the way that they're going to, if this project is going to go ahead, the way they are going to relocate these families, which will need to be built for new households, and their livelihoods that they will have lost, they will need to fix that even before the project ends. But the bigger challenge here, Peter, is the effects, adverse effects on the farming communities across the range where the pipeline is going to be built. The fishing community, the communities that depend on forested land that the pipeline is going to pass through, and the environmental degradation that will follow that. These are real issues that both governments of Uganda and Tanzania will need to address immediately.
What might be the economic spin-offs that are making this deal compelling?
I think one of the major benefits of this deal is the sheer amount of investments that this project is going to attract. $3.5 billion in building the pipeline, and in exporting the oil, we're looking at $150 billion worth of oil being exported through this pipeline. Huge amount of earnings for both Uganda and Tanzania. Now, there will be other spin-offs, including creation of jobs for the young people, professional engineers, petrochemical engineers that will have to be hired. All these are going to be spin-offs coming out of this particular project. And this is good for Uganda and Tanzania.
All right, but there does seem to be entities that are losing faith in this. We saw the Alliance Group pulling out of this East African crude oil pipeline project, joining 7 other insurance companies and 15 banks that have declined to back this pipeline. What do they know that is causing them to step back in this way? And what does this mean for the future of this project?
I think the major thing here is that many feel that perhaps the governments in Uganda and Tanzania have not adequately prepared for to compensate the families and communities that are going to be affected by this project, and then there is continuously increasing risk and a more a robust response and protests by indigenous communities whose land, livelihoods, and culture is going to be affected by this particular project. And insufficient response or address or mitigation by both governments have also made these insurance companies and potential investors to chicken out of these particular projects.
All right, and that's where we'll leave it. Dr. Mustafa Yusuf-Ali, a scholar of international relations, specializing on security, media, and conflict. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Always good to talk to you. Asante sana.
Thank you for having me.
All right, have a good evening. All right, and that's where we'll leave that conversation for the time being. We'll see how this one plays out. So not a lot of backing at this stage. The governments of Uganda and Tanzania look at this as a huge economic opportunity, but there are potential consequences all the way along this project. So we'll keep a track on that for you. Stay with us. You're watching The Globe.